Hi everyone, Heather here with AstroLada.com, and today I'm going to be diving deep into all 12 zodiac signs, and the theme of this video is the good, the bad, the ugly, because I'm going to be sort of examining the shadow side or sort of the negative attributes of each sign and along with the positive attributes, and we're going to be talking about what a sign is like when it's out of balance or when it's sort of traumatized and going on the defense, when it's wounded in some sort of way. And, you know, each of the zodiac signs have these very positive and very negative attributes. And there's also some qualities of the signs that sort of fall somewhere in the middle, right? And so each of us has a lot of these qualities in our birth charts. And, you know, each of the signs can display these qualities throughout different periods in their lifetime or within different contexts or in response to certain stimuli or different things that come up in their life. So one person isn't always going to be the same way just because they're an Aries, right? And some people's experience of like Aries or Taurus or whatever sign is going to be different than other people's experience with that sign, because different people with different signs will show up in different ways depending on how that energy has been utilized within their life, what their experience has been, what traumas they've endured, what crises they've had to sort of move and navigate through, and, you know, also just kind of where they're at in their own personal development and their own growth, their own level of self-understanding and self-awareness, and their own ability to harness the good qualities, right, of these signs and to work through the difficult stuff. Not that we should completely ignore it, right? That's definitely not the case. We need to be aware of what's going on, and that way we can sort of utilize, you know, the strengths and work through the challenges of each of these sign placements. And a lot of times when, you know, the sun or the rising, and this is going to be about, you know, primarily this will be applicable to the sun and rising signs. You know, the moon sign as well can be applicable, and I'll kind of give you the different variations of that. But really you can, you know, utilize these descriptions for any, you know, of the signs, for any of the planets. For example, if you had, you know, Venus in the sign of Virgo, the way that you would interrelate with other people would be very, you know, critical, judgmental. You'd tend to be more critical and hypercritical of your partner. But you do so out of wanting to help them, right? Out of love. Hopefully, ideally, right? And, you know, because the highest expression of Virgo is to show up in service, right? But Virgo Venuses can be very, very critical and judgmental of their partnerships. So this could apply for any of the planets that are being involved, but really, you know, this is more or less going to be about, you know, sun, rising sign, the way that we show up in the world. And I don't want anyone to feel necessarily like offended by anything that I'm going to be saying. There are good and bad qualities to each sign. As a Virgo, I am very aware of the negative qualities of the sign of Virgo. And so, you know, I'll be sort of dragging myself through the mud along with all the other signs. And we'll be talking about the positive attributes of these signs as well. And, you know, who better to judge all of the zodiac signs than a Virgo, right? I'm kidding, by the way. But yeah, so I'm going to try to keep this, you know, light and informative and all of that, but we will be going into, you know, some of the more serious stuff as well. And so we're going to start with Aries, of course, because Aries tends to be quite impatient, right? That's one of the sort of difficult attributes of the Aries sign. And we'll go all the way to Pisces. And some of these signs are going to be a little bit easier in terms of the energy than others, right? Because especially when we're talking about the sun and the rising sign, those are very physical signs. And so, you know, like the fire signs tend to do better, you know, with the sun and the fire signs versus the sun and the water signs, and vice versa, and things like that. So you have to take into account what planet you're looking at as well, to get a better feel for this and a better idea. But in general, we're going to talk about each sign in you know, a good amount of detail, as much as we can within this hour that we have. Okay. And so for Aries, so Aries is a sign that can be very, very driven, hardworking, ambitious, motivated. They kind of want what they want when they want it, right? They're very energetic. And when you have someone who has a strong Aries presence in their birth chart, their presence in the physical reality, their presence when they walk into a room is very much felt. You know that they're there, right? It's like, wow, I can feel this. This is a tangible energy. Sometimes they can be like a whirlwind, like they can be very, very disruptive. When they come into a room, when they come into your environment. And, you know, they tend to be, in terms of the way that they act when they're off balance, or the way that they sort of display the opposite end of the spectrum, the shadow aspects of Aries, if that's how you want to describe it, is they can be very aggressive. They can be self-centered, and impulsive, flaky, all of these things. But really, you know, when an Aries sign, a Aries sun sign or an Aries rising sign is traumatized or wounded or something along those lines, they go on the defense and they can become very aggressive, and they can have a very quick temper, right? If something triggers them the right way, they're very quick to react. So they're very reactionary. So instead of responding, right, which is different than reacting, Aries people tend to react, and it's a very visceral reaction. And so sometimes you might get sort of the bad end of that. And so you might have had an experience with an Aries person where they were triggered and they instantaneously, you know, reacted and got angry, and they can become aggressive. They can become, on the worst sort of end of that spectrum, they can become violent if they have sort of negative aspects to their sun or something along those lines. But usually that's not the case. Usually it's more, they're just overtly sort of verbally aggressive. They can anger really quickly. They can heat up really quickly. But you know, this can make it so, you know, it's a little bit difficult to compromise with an Aries. It can be a little bit difficult to deal with that energy, right? Because when they're in a certain mindset, that's all that there is. They have a difficult time placing themselves in the other person's shoes. They have a difficult time accounting for the needs of the other. And so that's something that they need to work to integrate within their lifetime, is integrating the opposition, the opposite sign. That's something that my teacher, Robert Phoenix, always talks about, is integrating the opposition, right? And that's how you come into balance, and that's how you come into the more evolved state of each of these signs. And speaking of Robert, by the way, I did an interview with him about Chiron and Aries, which I'm going to be uploading on AstroLada's YouTube channel here, and that's going to be up on Tuesday, so don't miss that, because that's a very interesting talk that we had. But anyway, so, you know, they can have difficulty compromising with others. They can have difficulty compromising their will. They want what they want when they want it, right? They're very bullheaded. They're very strong-willed people. And so once they learn to integrate, though, when you learn to integrate the needs of the other person, to account for their needs, to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, they can become much more compassionate, and they can learn to, you know, inspire others and motivate others through their actions, right? That's the highest expression of Aries. It's to act on their own free will and to show and lead others how to do the same, right? So it's inspiring and motivating through action, through demonstrating, you know, how to use and exercise will, but you know, accounting for the needs of others, not stepping on other people's toes, integrating that Libra energy as well. You know, one of the other things too is that Aries people can tend to be kind of bossy, and they can have a bad temper, which I mentioned before. And so those two things in combination can be a little bit dangerous sometimes, if the person is way off balance, or way in their own head, in their own space, right? Because there is that self-centered sort of energy with Aries, where a lot of times if they're really off balance, you try to talk to an Aries person and they do not hear you. They only hear what they want to hear, and they want to just constantly be talking about themselves in one way or another. So the conversation will always be redirected toward that person, their problems, what they're going through, almost to the point where it could seem a little narcissistic sometimes, but it's not necessarily always the case. It's just that they're always really excited and passionate about something. They're always, you know, involved in what action they're going to be taking next, what they want to do. And so they can be very, very passionate people too, which is another really good quality of the Aries sign. And so, you know, they have to, if they lean toward aggression, right, especially if their sun is like badly aspected or something like that, maybe there's a square from Pluto or a square from Mars, and that would amp it up a little bit, then, you know, it's a challenge to learn to be less reactionary and more responsive, right, and to put themselves in other people's shoes and to integrate that opposition. And so that's one of the the biggest challenges for the Aries energy, to learn to compromise, right? To learn to compromise, to play nice, to learn to share. Those will be the kids that don't want to share their toys, that kind of thing. Another thing too, just as a side note, before we move on to Taurus, is that people who have the conjunction between the sun or the rising sign to Eris, which is a dwarf planet that lies beyond the realm of Pluto, they can tend toward passive aggressiveness to the point where it's like, it's a little extreme, right? So they can err toward being extremely passive aggressive. And so if you have, the sun or the rising in conjunction to Aries, that's a disruptive energy in and of itself. But for whatever reason, I've noticed this in people who have sun and rising signs with the conjunction to Aries, is that there's a passive aggressive nature. And so, that's just kind of something to be aware of and to look out for as well. So, for the most part, Aries has no issue expressing their anger, but sometimes it can come across passive aggressively if there are certain other things going on in their birth chart. Okay. And then for Taurus, so Taurus, is a sign that's very sensual, very earthy, very grounded, very in tune with the physical reality. They're very into touch and experiencing material pleasure. And they can err toward the side of the extreme of that, right? Which is being very materialistic and overly focused on the material realm to the extent where they sort of negate the emotional realm, the spiritual realm, the other aspects of their being, because they're so focused on the physical and having that material stability, acquiring material resources. That's usually not the case with Taurus people. They usually can, they know to appreciate things that have true value, right? They'll hold on to things that have value beyond just monetary value, that things that are very long lasting, right? That are made well. They appreciate good craftsmanship and things like that. But there are some Taurus people that are very greedy. And so sometimes that's true, in an early childhood experience or a life experience of having to grab for resources. And so they learn that they need to take the resources and hold on to them, or else they won't get enough. Or it could be that they just enjoy the material realm a little bit too much, right? So they're a little overly self-indulgent, a little overly indulgent in materialism and in the acquiring of resources, to the point where they can become ruthless, right? And they don't care about the needs of other people. They're also very frugal to the point where they can become very stingy. And so I've known some Taurus people who will, they're very notorious for like regifting things and things like that, because they're like, well, if I don't want to use this, I'm going to give it to somebody else. They're not going to buy something new. So it can come across as being a little stingy, and sometimes it is stingy, sometimes it is. It just kind of depends on the person. And they can be very rigid and very uncompromising. They don't like change, and that's one of the biggest downfalls of Taurus, because it is fixed earth. It's the most stable of all the signs, but it's also the most rigid and the most inflexible. And so they do not do well with change. They do not handle change well. Even in the Uranus and Taurus videos that I was doing, I was, telling about a lot of the positive changes that can come across for the Taurus people. And everybody was like, oh no, all the Taurus people were like, I don't want any change to happen. That's awful. Even if it's positive change, they can have difficulty with that because they're so, they're one of the more nostalgic signs. Taurus and Leo are both very, very deeply nostalgic. And Taurus is more nostalgic in a physical sense. They don't like to change what's going on in their physical reality. They like to keep it very stable, safe, and secure. They take the safe route. And so, they can miss a lot of opportunities because they're so stubborn and so rigid in their mindset when it comes to the way they think that things need to be, or wanting to hold on to the way things were, especially when it comes to their physical presence in this world. And so, they can kind of panic at the slightest signs of change. And so that's kind of, one of the difficult Taurus qualities that needs to be integrated. And, one of the things too, of course, is that you have to sort of integrate the opposition, right? Which is Scorpio. Scorpio is the least materialistic of all the signs. It's about detaching yourself from materialism. Scorpio holds on to emotions and experiences instead of materialistic sort of things. Scorpios have no issue with just purging and getting rid of physical objects. They have no attachment to these things. And so Scorpios are kind of learning the opposite lesson. They're more about like power and control and all these other things as well. Taurus wants to control the physical. Scorpio wants to control the other sorts of energies and realms, right? And so Taurus has to learn to let go of the attachment to the physical. And usually this will happen, through some sort of crisis where they lose, money or resources, or they lose something that they really cared about in terms of like something material and physical. And so they'll have to learn to deal with this sort of crisis, and they'll have to become more flexible, right? They'll learn to surrender control a little bit more, and they'll learn to move with change. And, they can become very, they can become very helpful to other people and more generous after they go through this process of integrating the Scorpio nature, right? So they can become less self-protective, less cautious, and more generous with their resources and their ability to navigate and deal with the material realm. They can teach others how to deal with materialism and how to deal with their resources a little bit better, and how to appreciate, you know, the physical, the tangible, the sensual, how to appreciate nature, and, you know, those types of things. They do have that ability, but, you know, when they feel threatened, they really want to hold on to the physical and what's going on in the physical realm. They do not want to let go of that. And so that's something that they have to sort of work through. They can be very stubborn, but they can also, on the flip side of that, be very patient, right? Very gentle, very patient, very humble, most of the time, you know, if they're in balance and all of that. So there's a big difference between a Taurus who's in balance and a Taurus who's out of balance, right? A Taurus who is acting defensively due to some sort of trauma or woundedness, or, you know, a Taurus who's in balance, who's in equilibrium, who feels comfortable, safe, and secure. Those are two different sorts of energies, right? And that's going to be the same for each of these signs. For Gemini, Gemini is an interesting one. I love Geminis. I have a lot of very close Gemini friends. They can be very playful, very fun, very witty, very inquisitive, right? You know, being a Virgo myself, you know, getting along with them is pretty easy because they're very intelligent, so we can have really good conversations. But on the flip side of this, a Gemini who's out of balance, who has difficult aspects maybe to their sun or to their rising sign, or who's just going through a difficult time period, or who has experienced some sort of trauma, so they're on the defense, right? They're putting up their shields. They can be very, very manipulative. That is very much a Gemini trait. I've had Gemini friends that even admitted that they're being manipulative, but they think that they're doing it for the other person's well-being, right? Or they justify it to themselves by saying, well, this is what that person needs. They just don't know any better. So I'm going to manipulate them into doing what's best for them, right? Like that's kind of a Gemini thing as well. Or they'll just be openly and overtly manipulative, and they'll know that they're doing it on the sort of worst end of that spectrum, especially, you know, if there's a difficult Pluto aspect involved, or a difficult Neptune aspect involved. That Neptune aspect is more like they might not be self-aware, they might not know that they're doing it. But with Pluto, maybe a Pluto square to the sun or something in Gemini, that's someone who can, not always, it doesn't mean they're going to be manipulative, they can be very manipulative. If they're not manipulative in and of their own right, they're going to attract people that are manipulative. And even the ones that are not overtly and sort of manipulative in a negative way will be manipulative just to play devil's advocate in a way that's sort of you know, just to sort of push people's buttons and to see what will happen because they're curious. I've seen that as well. I've had friends who have done things like that. So they'll do very interesting things just to sort of see what's going to happen, just to play with people and toy with people a little bit. And but when they do it to get what they want, right? When they do it in a way that is sort of infringing on somebody else's will, it's usually because they're afraid, they're vulnerable, right? They're afraid of losing something or someone. They're afraid they're not going to get their needs met. And so that's usually because of an experience of not getting their needs met, again, early on in life, in early childhood. And so they learn that they need to adapt and be a certain way in different social situations or in different situations in general. That's one of the Gemini qualities, right? They can be who they need to be whenever they need to be that way in order to get what they want, or in order to fit in with other people and connect with them. So it can go both ways, right? It can be a way to form good connections with people, to adapt and to sort of merge, you know, with the group that they're in, or it can be used as a way to gain people's trust and manipulate them. And, you know, when they do become manipulative, it's because they're protecting themselves, right? They're protecting themselves. They feel like their needs are not going to get met. They might have had an experience like that where their needs were not met. And so they feel like they have to play games in order to get what they want. And so that can be a thing. They are tricksters in the positive and negative light. They'll play games, right? They'll play games that are fun and lighthearted, and they'll play games that can be a little bit more diabolical sometimes. So that's sort of the Gemini quality. And not to hate on Geminis, I do love Geminis, but, you know, they can be, you know, a little bit scattered, a little bit flaky. Sometimes, again, they show up as like dual personalities. They'll be one person one day, and then the next day they'll be a different person. Two different people will have a completely different experience of the same person if they have a lot of Gemini in them. They can be very divisive, you know, very dualistic. They can cause a lot of divisiveness as well, just with their presence and their action and the way that they sort of engage with the world sometimes. And they subconsciously tend to seek to be out of balance. I've noticed that as well. So if things are too balanced and too harmonious, they'll go off and, like, you know, change it in some sort of way to sort of, it's a mutable air sign, right? It's the most unstable of all of the zodiac signs, and it seeks instability. And so, you know, they'll sort of rattle cages and they'll change things up just to create that instability that they need in order to feel comfortable. And that's another thing too, is that there's a discomfort with too much comfort. There's a discomfort with too much stability. And so that can cause them to stir up a little bit of trouble just to sort of get out of that stable place where it doesn't feel necessarily comfortable for them. But they are really, really good at communicating. They're very playful, very inquisitive. They're brilliant, brilliant people. And so, you know, when you have a lot of Gemini energy, you're usually highly, highly intelligent. And that's why they can be a little bit dangerous on the manipulative side, right? Because they're so smart that they know how to get what they want. They know how to read people. They know how to play with people in that way. But, you know, they can use that. They can use that for good, and they can use that for positive things, and they can, you know, teach other people. They can communicate in ways that other people can't, where they can take these big, broad concepts and turn them into something that's easier for people to grasp and understand. That's when they're integrating, right, that philosophical energy. They need to learn to integrate the energy of Sagittarius, which Sagittarius is very authentic. It's very blunt. Sagittarius is a sign that is who it is, like, all the time. Like, Sagittarius just shows up as Sagittarius. They are who they are. They're not, there's no game playing at all. They don't understand game playing. They don't understand the dualistic nature of this reality. Those types of things don't sit well with, you know, Sagittarius. So when you integrate that energy and you integrate the integrity of Sagittarius, then you can start utilizing your intellectual capacities for good, right? And so, you know, it teaches you to, and also Geminis teach you not to take life so seriously, right? Because they're very playful and they are that trickster sign. And so, you know, there is a lightheartedness to the Gemini sign. There is that quality there as well. And so once they learn to integrate, you know, the opposition, which is, you know, Sagittarius, which is morality, which is, you know, which is more cohesive and coherent, right? Not just split personalities doing different things, manipulating different people. It's more like being who you are in all situations and showing up as that person, integrating a little bit more of that energy where it's a little bit more coherent, and integrating that philosophy, integrating that integrity. So, you know, you can utilize that in your day-to-day life. That's really going to help to allow that more evolved, more intelligent, more useful, helpful, genuine, authentic Gemini energy, which is there, right? It is there. Anytime you're talking about one sign, you're also talking about the opposite. And usually to come into balance, you need to integrate those opposite energies. And so, you know, that's Gemini. And again, I do love Gemini people. It is just, it happens to be one of the more difficult sun signs for whatever reason. Okay. And so let's see. We're going to get into Cancer now. So Cancers, Cancers are a very deeply intuitive, deeply feeling sign. You know, all of the water signs are a little bit difficult for the sun and for the rising, just because they're so non-physical, they're so receptive, they're so retentive. So they feel everything so deeply. They feel other people's emotions so deeply. And they can, all the water signs, one of the sort of downfalls of them is that they're very sensitive to betrayal. And so, excuse me, Cancer is one of the overly sort of sensitive signs where they take things a little bit too personally, and they are overly sensitive to betrayal. And when they feel traumatized, when they feel like they're being attacked in some way, they can become overly defensive, right? They're very, very defensive and very protective of themselves and of the people that they really care about, right? They're the nurturing sign. They're the sign of family. It's like this, like, mama bear energy, where if you mess with my people, if you mess with my family, you know, they're going to come after you. So they're very, very protective of themselves and what they hold dear. So they will lash out at you. People will be surprised because Cancer seems so gentle and so nurturing and so emotionally connected. You know, it's not a very fiery sign at all, but as soon as, you know, they feel like they need to go on the defense, they will strike, they will attack. And, you know, that's just one of their qualities. So you'll see a lot of Cancer signs just lashing out, and it'll be like almost like irrational, like it's just full of so much emotion. And, you know, they can also be, I kind of want to, it's like kind of passive aggressive. Not the same way that like Aries conjunct Eris is, but they can be very passive aggressive and very defensive in that way. You know, because if you think about Cancer, right? Cancer is the crab. What does a crab do when it's like, you know, startled or scared? It like walks sideways, right? It takes a sideways approach to expressing its anger. And that's not necessarily just when it's on the defense, just in general. Cancer people can be, you know, a little bit passive aggressive in the way that they express themselves, because they don't necessarily want to hurt anyone's feelings, because they are so empathic and nurturing and intuitive and compassionate that they'll try to hold it in, but then it'll end up coming out passive aggressively. And so that's another sort of negative attribute, or sort of difficult attribute that can come through with, you know, Cancer and with Cancer people. Else about them, they can be vengeful. I've noticed that too with Cancer people. They'll hold grudges for a very long time. Cancer knows how to hold a grudge, one of them for sure. So you know they'll hold on to things. They're, you know, especially with Cancer moon people, but in general Cancer people, they have very good memories and very good memories for emotions. So if a situation can cause a big or sort of negative emotional experience, they're going to hold on to that, and they're going to keep that, you know, in their mind until it's the right moment. And it's sort of like a Scorpio sort of thing, or a Scorpio energy sort of thing, because Scorpios will do that too. They'll keep it inside, and then they'll just take it out at the last moment or at the right moment, but they'll be holding on to things in order to like sort of sting other people, or other people. Cancer will be winning to complain about that one thing that you did years ago that they really hurt them. You know, they'll bad up when they're in an emotion and you're having a fight and kind of thing, right? So it's a little bit of a different energy, but it's still there. So they'll hold on to things, and they'll hold, and you'll not even know that they still have this even in their awareness. You might have forgotten about it, and they'll bring it up. And that's another thing that kind of happens with Cancers. And so they can be, again, very very overprotective, be very self-defensive, sensitive. And, you know, the defensiveness comes especially when they've been traumatized, if they have difficult aspects to their sun or their rising or planet we're talking about, especially with like Mars and Pluto, be very defensive. As soon as they sense like a hint of betrayal, they'll just go immediately on the defense and go on the attack. And so that can be the dual aspect of Cancer. You know, with the evolved Cancer is going to, you know, be able to be empathic without going overboard, right? Without being overly attached to the way things feel, without being overly sensitive to what's going on. They can ground it out a little bit and realize that not everything about them. It's not a personal attack, and they're integrating a little bit of a more structured, more grounded, more pragmatic energy that comes along with the opposition, which is Capricorn, right? So they learn how to integrate that opposite sign and that opposite energy. And so, you know, they have to be very careful also of the environments that they're in. They can be very retentive to acts that are detrimental, negative, or difficult. And so, you know, if you're, especially the environment, the people that are around you are important as well, but the environment is important all the same, because if the environment is sort of dark and dingy, you know, there's a lot of fights that went on there or something, they're gonna pick up on that, and that's gonna affect them more so than other people. But so they can be, so the more evolved aspect of this is that they can ground this energy. They can be deeply nurturing. They can be empathetic and helpful and useful in that way, where they care for other people, where they nurture other people, and then they can be protective, but only, you know, as needed, where it's not necessarily them just going overboard, going defense, right? It's about tap back and like learning how to protect people without you know, going a little overboard with that. And so, you know, when they feel safe, when they feel supported, when they feel at home, they can be creative and very motherly. They love to care for other people. They love to, you know, create that feeling of safety and security. And so, you know, that is why they get a little defensive sometimes, and that is why a little overprotective. And you know, so it's just reining that in and learning how to deal with that a little bit more in a balanced way and in a more appropriate way. Okay. And so Leo people, So Leos, I actually really love Leos. Leos are one of my favorite signs. They're very optimistic and charismatic and generous and fun, playful, and they usually are authentic in sharing themselves with other people. They're sharing their hearts with other people, and so they have all this really beautiful energy. And obviously the sun is at home in the sign of Leo. So if your sun sign is in Leo, that's going to be a little bit different than some of the other planets being in Leo, which can be a little bit more difficult. Like the moon in Leo can be very prideful, and they can get their ego hurt pretty easily. Leo sun sign, kind of same thing though. So they're deeply vulnerable people. Even if they show this like pride where it borders on arrogance, sometimes they're deeply well. This is a protective mechanism. They want to show up acting like the golden child or the golden person, where they're getting the recognition. They want to feel special. They want to feel like people appreciate their talents, what it is that they're creating out into the world. And so their egos can be very fragile, can be very vulnerable. They're like little kittens inside, even if they're lions outside. And they need to feel special. And the wounded expression of if you've been traumatized, wounded, or if you're just feeling defensive, right? If you're feeling attacked, Leo people almost always play like an inflated sense of pride and an inflated sense of ego, where they're like larger than life. When you find a Leo who is overly narcissistic, which isn't as common as you would, sometimes they can show up and narcissistic and all that. But usually I haven't seen a lot of that. It's usually when there's like different aspects to the sun that they come across that way. But it does happen, right? When they are, narcissistic, when they are very egoic, when they are very pride, very inflated and very grandiose about the way that they come across, it's usually because they are deeply hurt and traumatized, wounded inside, and they are very vulnerable. So they want to convince themselves and other people that they are untouchable, that they are the greatest, they are the best. So they feel that way internally, they act that way externally, but really they're hiding something, right? And you come across someone who's acting in that way, it's usually because there's a vulnerable aspect of themselves that they're not touching on, that they're hiding, they're repressing, that they're trying to protect, right? So they're trying to protect inner child, right? Leo rules children as well. And so, when you come across someone like that, just know that they're doing because they're vulnerable, right? Just like all of us, they're vulnerable. And even if they don't necessarily show it, it's there. Another thing too is that they really need people in their life who they can call them out on their shit. They won't necessarily won't be overtly appreciative of it, right? But they need to be knocked down a couple pegs every so often. Otherwise, they will get to that place very egoic, and they're the king, right? So it's kind of like the emperor wears no clothes, right? And he's walking around all naked and nobody's pointing it out. They need that because they are so likable, right? And so charismatic, and they have that really great energy about them where people don't necessarily want to hurt them or tell them anything that's going on that's like negative about them and those types of things. So they can be but they do need someone in their life who can do that, right? They need people who can call them out, who can tell them how they're being, who can show them themselves, because sometimes they can't see that. They're blinded by their own light, right? That's another sort of Leo quality. Another thing too with Leos is that I've noticed that they take themselves very seriously. And so even though they have that playful nature, and sometimes they can be a little self-depreciating where they're making jokes about themselves at their own expense, but don't ever think that that's a cue that you can make jokes about them, because they will not like that. That's another thing too. They take themselves very seriously. So even if they are joking about themselves, they're allowed to joke about themselves, but you're not allowed to do that, right? So that's kind of another thing that I've noticed a lot with Leo people as well. So, don't necessarily poke fun at a Leo if you want to get on their good side. But if you want to be a good friend or partner to someone who's a Leo, they do need someone who can call them out on their stuff. Not necessarily in a joking way, right? Because they don't like to have their feelings, their ego hurt. They don't like to be made fun of, but in a way where you're being honest and genuine and authentic and connecting with them in that heartfelt way that they appreciate, right? Because that's Leo. Leo likes to connect from the heart, and they like that genuine sort of energy where people are being authentic with them. And they need that. And some Leos don't get that at all. And so when they find that, they'll actually really gravitate toward it. Even if it's a little difficult for them, they'll be drawn in, right? Because they want to know, they want to see themselves, and they have a hard time doing so. And so the other thing too is that they can be very nostalgic. And that's not necessarily a bad quality or anything like that. I just, it's, you know, something about Leos that I've noticed. They really hold on to like sentimental things, to the past, to the way things were, to the glory days and those types of things. So Leos can be very sentimental. So if you want to find a good present for a Leo, find something sentimental to give to them, right? Find something nostalgic. And, you know, the evolved sort of aspect of Leo is sort of some of the positive qualities that we've already been talking about. They're very generous. They're very loving. They can lead in a way where they're leading by example, where they're motivating others, they're inspiring others, but they're not abusing their power, right? Where they realize that, where they kind of come down to earth a little bit, they become a little bit more humble, where they take on a little bit of that opposition too, which is the sign of Aquarius, right? Which Aquarius can be a little bit more aloof, a little bit more detached. They don't take everything so personally. And so they need to take that energy on, right? Where they can become a little bit more detached, where they're not so involved in everything that's going on, you know, where they get their hearts broken and they get their feelings hurt all of the time. So they need to learn to take on that detached awareness. They need to learn how to play nicely with the group, right? And to bring themselves a little bit more back down to earth, so that way they can lead in a way that is not encroaching on other people. And that so they do use authority well. Usually they can take to authority very well, and you know, as long as they don't have anything really crazy going on, they can be very good in leadership positions and in positions of authority, because they can be very caring, very charismatic, very genuine, very authentic, very heartfelt. And you know, they're one of my favorite signs, of course, but you know, there are good and bad qualities again to each sign. And so, you know, this is kind of just comparing all of those so you can see the full spectrum here. All right. And Virgo. So being a Virgo myself, I know this one all too well. Virgos can be very, very anxious. That's one of the big things. Very nervous, very neurotic. You know, they tend to want to control and perfect everything. They're highly perfectionistic. They're control freaks a lot of the times, or at least they can come across that way. And of course, one of the biggest sort of defense mechanisms that the Virgo tends to use is judgment and criticism, criticizing other people, because they're so self-conscious and they're so perfectionistic, they're so self-critical that you know, it's not necessarily that it's intended to be malicious. Sometimes it is, but usually they do this as a way of taking the spotlight off of them, right? To take the attention off of them and their own imperfections, their own sort of negative qualities and attributes and things like that. They're putting the spotlight on other people's problems and other people's issues and other people's sort of stuff, right? Because when they're pointing out other people and like their issues, right, then there's less focus on them and they don't have to focus on themselves, right? That they judge other people and that person is so much worse than them, then they don't have to look at, you know, how imperfect and how, you know, how flawed they are. So they point out other people's flaws as a way. Usually it's a way of helping other people, right? Virgos will help other people by criticizing them. They'll think it's constructive. They'll think that they're helping, and not everyone takes it that way, right? But they can also criticize people in a way that's a little bit more malicious. They can judge people in a way that's a little bit more malicious, and they have a difficulty just not judging people. Like, not judging people is difficult for Virgos in general, right? So, you know, you have to learn not to judge others. You have to learn also not to be so critical of yourself, because they can be very self-depreciating, very self-critical, very perfectionistic. And usually that's because Virgo sun sign people in particular, and Virgo rising sign, Virgo moon sign, they usually have one or more perfectionistic sort of parents, or they were brought up in a perfectionistic environment where they had a parent who was very critical and judgmental of them. So they start to internalize that sense of judgment and criticism, because they know that everything they're doing is wrong. A lot of times, especially with the sun, it can be the father. With the moon, it can be the mother. With the rising, it could be anyone really in the environment. But it's someone who told them that they were wrong, that they were flawed, that they were doing things incorrectly, that they were not perfect, that they were not all that great. And so they learn to criticize themselves in the same way. And so as a way of deflecting that, they'll usually, you know, criticize and judge other people, especially when they're feeling really badly about themselves. And so that's, you know, a very common Virgo trait. And they can be control freaks, right? They don't like to feel embarrassed. They don't like to feel like they don't know what they're talking about, or they, you know, or to feel stupid. So Virgos will be very precise in what they're doing and what they're saying. They'll be very, very controlling of their environment and sort of what goes on around them sometimes. And again, that's a way of negating that judgment, that criticism. And so if you come across a Virgo who's very judgmental and very critical, it's usually because they're hurting inside. And if they're judging you, they're judging themselves 20 times more. And so just know that, right? So this is also a way where you can start to understand, other people in your life who are showing up in these ways and why maybe they're doing these types of things. But yeah, so they're almost too self-aware, right? They're very self-conscious. They're constantly critiquing themselves, constantly judging themselves. They're constantly overthinking everything that they're doing, ruminating on things. And so they have to learn to integrate the opposite, which is Pisces, right? Which is learning to go with the flow, learning to be a little bit more compassionate toward yourself and toward other people. Once you integrate that compassion, you're able to show up in service of other people with that analytical and judgmental ability, right? Where you're able to show people their stuff, but do it in a compassionate way where it actually is helpful, where you're accounting for their needs and where they're at. And it's not doing it to deflect your own flaws. You're doing it because you care about people and you have this ability to really, piece things together and understand other people because you've spent so much time working on these types and ruminating on these types of things for so many years. And so, Virgos, because they are so, self-conscious and self-critical, they tend to be very, very humble. And the highest expression of Virgo is always to show up in service of other people. And so once you start to integrate Pisces, which Pisces is the opposite end, right? Virgo shows up in service in a way that's very practical, very logical. Pisces can err on the side of being the martyr. And so when you integrate a little bit more of that Pisces energy, though, it's like a balanced form of service where you're doing it and you're accounting for the other person's needs. You're being very compassionate, very loving in the way that you're providing service for others. Okay, and then Libra. Libra has a lot of different things going on. People tend to really like Libras because they're very charismatic. They're usually very attractive, very soft-spoken, very receptive. They like to, be in relationship and be with other people. They're very good at bringing balance and bringing the opposite perspective into the mix. But they can tend to be too soft-spoken and too polite because they don't want to rattle anyone else's cages. They don't want the attention or the spotlight to be on them. They can have sort of the tendency to become a little bit of a doormat where they're too involved in the needs of other people. They're always accounting for the needs of the other. And so it can cause them to, take on too much or let other people walk all over them. So they need to learn and make sure that they're being assertive, right? Integrating that opposite energy, which is the sign of Aries, which is very assertive and very strong-willed and gets what it wants when it wants it. And so Libra needs to learn to account for its own needs and include the needs of the other. They can be obsessed with fairness too and equality and, things being fair all the time. That can be another thing. And a lot of times they're seeking permission. So there's this energy they're seeking permission from other people to do things or to live their lives in a certain way. And an example of this would be, even with Mercury and Libra, which is what I have. If I'm stuck on a decision, I need to talk it out with other people. And it's almost like I'm asking for permission to make the decision that I need to make, right? And so that can be an issue with Mercury and Libra, where you're constantly overthinking things, balancing things out, over considering the needs of the other people. And just Libra in general tends to do that too. And because of this, they can be very indecisive, right? Because they have a hard time rectifying their own needs with the needs of other people in their lives. And so, it can make them ambivalent, indecisive. They can have a lot of difficulty moving through life if they're constantly waiting for permission from other people or seeking out permission from other people. They have difficulty sometimes acting of their own volition. And another thing too is that they'll fall in love with love. So they're constantly seeking partnership even to the point where, if they're in partnership with someone, but they're on a vacation or they're away from that person for extended period of time, they'll cheat on that person just to have that feeling of partnership, right? But it won't be a cheating, a fling usually, or a one night stand. It'll be an ongoing sort of thing where they're connecting with the person. So it feels like they're in relationship when they're outside of their relationship. And so that's another thing too that happens with Libra people. They might have multiple partners going on just because they always need to feel like they're in companionship. They have difficulty being just with themselves. And so the sort of evolved Libra obviously is very fair, very equal, very balanced. They're good at creating harmony and bringing balance into different situations. They are considerate of the needs of others, but without necessarily allowing other people to step on their toes, or without being overly considerate where they become frozen and unable to act. They become more comfortable once they integrate that Aries energy in being with themselves and doing what they want to do and acting on their own self-interest and their own needs. And they're really good at bringing in that opposite perspective, right? Because they're concerned about making things fair and balanced and about equality and justice. And so they're very considerate of other people's needs. And they can also be very creative too, especially when it comes to things that are aesthetically pleasing, you know, things that make things beautiful, that beautify the environment, that beautify the experience. Okay. And then Scorpio. There's a lot to be said about Scorpio, of course. And this is my rising sign, so I'm not hating on Scorpios. I love Scorpios. Again, one of my favorite signs. And Scorpios, you know, we know some of the negative qualities of Scorpios. Most of us do. They can be very paranoid, very suspicious, distrustful, manipulative, power hungry, you know, control hungry, those types of things. But, you know, the evolved state of Scorpio, they can be very psychic, very discerning. They learn how to read people and how to understand power and how to use power in a very positive, very beneficial way. You know, they're usually really good at dealing with crisis. They're laser focused on things, and their nature is to transform, right? They're here to transform and to take one thing, to let it go and turn it into something new. But they can be very paranoid. They can be very suspicious of other people. They are the most sensitive to betrayal of all of the signs. If they suspect even the slightest hint of betrayal or lying or deception, they will cut you out and you probably won't get back in. Whereas Cancer, right, they'll probably give you a second chance. They are sensitive to betrayal, but they might be a little bit more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt to let you back in. Scorpios are not like that. They have no problem cutting ties, letting things go when the need arises, right? Scorpio is about purging, letting go, releasing. And so, you know, sometimes they'll cut people off a little preemptively, even if something hasn't really happened, because they can tend toward being paranoid and suspicious and these types of things. And usually it's because they've had experiences with betrayal that really stuck out to them, right? Because they are so sensitive to betrayal. And so they don't want that to happen again. They don't want to be played as a fool. They want to be in control, right? They don't like being disempowered. They don't like feeling like they're losing their power, or giving up their power to someone else. So when they're manipulated or betrayed by someone, they take that very, very seriously. And so, you know, if you do find someone who's very paranoid, suspicious, cynical, a little intense, you know, who's a Scorpio, usually it's because, you know, they've had that experience that they're trying to protect themselves. And, you know, they can be, again, a little bit manipulative, a little bit deceitful, especially if that Scorpio energy is imbalanced, or if it's like a difficult aspect or something like that that's going on, or they can attract people who are the same. You know, if they feel threatened, though, they can be deceitful and manipulative in order to sort of take that control and power of that situation. So usually it's a defense mechanism. So if they feel threatened, if they feel like their identity is threatened, if they feel like something about them is being threatened in some sort of way, or there's a threat of betrayal or something like that, they'll take back the power by manipulating the situation, because they're very good at picking up on the subtle nuances of other people's behavior, reading between the lines, seeing, you know, picking up on subtle cues, like subtle nonverbal communication cues and things like that. So they can really read people, and they're really good at picking out like your biggest insecurity and just sticking that to you. Like, so don't, you know, if you get in a fight with a Scorpio, they're going to sting you, right? They're going to go on the defense and they're going to find that thing and they're going to use that thing. And that's one of the sort of Scorpio. So they can be very hot tempered as well. They are co-ruled by Mars, right? It's Pluto and Mars, both of which deal with power, right? That's why Scorpio has such like a powerful presence and a powerful energy, where people are either really drawn to that energy, or they're sort of taken aback by it, and they're almost fearful or intimidated by it. Like if you find like a really strong Scorpio energy person, you'll see that, you know, people will either be really, really attracted, they'll really want to, you know, be around that energy because they really like that power. And, you know, it's kind of like fulfilling some sort of need that maybe they're not expressing for themselves or something, or they'll feel like really intimidated. And usually it's like black and white. There's no middle ground. It's like one or the other. They're really drawn to it or they're really repelled by it. And So it's a lot about dealing with power. But anyway, so Mars being the ruler or co-ruler of Scorpio is one of the reasons why Scorpios tend to have a very quick temper. And when they have a quick temper, they'll find that one thing, that one insecurity, and they will sting you with that. And they're very good at uncovering these types of things, right? And another thing too is that, you know, Scorpio has a reputation for being quite promiscuous. A lot of times, especially with women, with men too, it can be the case, but especially with women, you know, who have a lot of Scorpio, they'll use promiscuity as a way of sort of feeling more, like allowing themselves to feel more empowered, right? So that works until it doesn't, right? It's empowering until it's very disempowering. So, you know, they can get stuck in these mindsets of, you know, wanting to feel empowered through sexual promiscuity, through, you know, having multiple partners, through, you know, having these really intense sexual experiences. And like I said before, it works until it doesn't, right? It can be empowering and then it's not. So, you know, they're trying to harness power. That's one of the main, like, Scorpio things. They're always trying to figure out who has the power and how they can utilize it, how they can, sometimes how they can manipulate it, right, in order to get their needs met. But again, once they learn to integrate the opposite, which is Taurus, right, which is more about being more grounded, more sensual, more down to earth, right? It's very different than Scorpio, which is very, very intense. Taurus is very chill, very mellow, and they can be a little more trusting sometimes. And so once you learn to integrate that other energy, that opposition, when you start to look at things in the physical sense, not just the non-physical, not just the emotional, the psychological, and all of that, and start incorporating some of that Taurus energy, which is, again, more grounded, more stable, more sensual, more down to earth, more calm. And when you integrate that, you can start to utilize these things for good, right? And so the good qualities of Scorpio, of course, that they're very discerning. They're very able to pick up on these, you know, subtle nuances of people's behavior. They're very able to read people. They're very psychic, very good at research, very good at getting to the bottom, to the core of things. And, you know, usually that can be a good thing where they can get to the core of something. They're really good at dealing with crisis. They can really focus on what they need to get to in order to transform that and make things better for, you know, everyone around them. And so they're very, very transformative and usually very sharp-minded too. So that's Scorpio. All right, so we're getting to Sagittarius now. Sagittarius sun, or the sun, usually does really well in Sagittarius. You know, they're usually high integrity people. They're usually a very charismatic, outgoing, jovial, adventurous. People really like them. They're really drawn to them. They're very philosophical. You know, they have sort of a really strong moral compass, but sometimes that can err on the side of self-righteousness, right? That is one of the difficult qualities of Sagittarius. They can be a little protective of their beliefs and of, you know, what they believe to be true and all that. So they tend to be a little self-righteous, a little smug when they're out of balance, right? So they think that they have the moral high ground, the moral superiority over other people because they're so philosophical and so evolved and, you know, all these things. And they also don't do well with too much structure and restriction, so they can be a little impulsive and a little flighty. So when they sense that they're being caged in, they'll really, really grab for freedom, right? They'll really go into a state of wanting to fly away and go do something else and go find the next adventure. So they have trouble sort of settling down on one thing. They can also be very, very blunt. And this isn't necessarily a defense mechanism. Sometimes it is, but it's because Sagittarius, like I mentioned before we were talking about Gemini, Sagittarius is who it is in all situations. They usually just show up as they are. They're just, you know, this is me, you know, and that they're very truthful and very authentic in that way. But they can also be very, very blunt in the way that they deliver information. And that can also go along with the self-righteousness and the smugness, and then it's just not received very well. But they are who they are in every situation, right? So they can be very blunt to the point where it's tactless. They have a difficulty understanding sarcasm too, I've noticed. Like, they don't get it. So if you're trying to, like, joke with a Sagittarius, maybe don't use sarcasm as the means for joking with them. That tends to be a Capricorn thing, by the way, too. Capricorns can have this really dry, sarcastic sense of humor that's just kind of off the wall and, like, a little unusual, which is interesting with Capricorn. But Sagittarius won't understand that, right? They take things at face value, so they can be very, very gullible. And so, you know, you have to be careful with that if you're a Sagittarius. You have to learn to integrate the opposite, right? Which is the dualistic nature of this reality. duality, understanding that things are not always what they seem, that some people don't just show up authentically, that people can be different ways in different situations, and learning how to integrate that a little bit yourself so you can adapt a little bit better, so you can deliver information, because they have this very wise, philosophical sort of energy, and they have an interest in these things, and they can be great teachers, but they have to integrate that Gemini energy where they deliver information in a way that's a little bit more tactful, a little less blunt, so people won't go on the defense when they're talking. They have to integrate, and they have to understand that there is, there's duality in this world. People are not always what they seem. Things are not always what they seem. And they have a difficult time sort of navigating that, which can make them a little bit gullible, and so they can fall prey to, victimization or manipulation or something like that. But the evolved state of Sagittarius is very, very high integrity, the most integrity of any sign. They always are who they are. They stick to their guns. They stick to their morals. Again, as long as they don't err to this point of being like self-righteous and dogmatic, and that they're usually not very dogmatic, but sometimes they can be. And they're just very jovial, very adventurous, very philosophical, very understanding of like deeper concepts, and they're very good at conveying these types of things for others to understand. And they like to learn through experience, right? So experiential learning, as opposed to Gemini, which is more analytical learning and focusing on just curiosities and like going all over the place. Usually Sagittarius has one goal, and they aim for that goal. But so I guess the most difficult thing is like this moral superiority and feeling like they're there's the right way to do it and that kind of thing. But they can be very, very wonderful, charismatic, jovial, high integrity people. Okay. And Sun usually does really well in Sagittarius in particular. All right, so now we're into Capricorn. So Capricorn, Capricorns are the hard workers, the leaders, the aristocrats, the sort of authoritarians. Sometimes they can be really great leaders. They can be really great at structure and form and being very practical, ambitious, very hardworking, very determined. On the opposite side, they can be a little too serious to the point where they become rigid and pessimistic. Pessimistic Capricorn is a Capricorn that's going to be a little bit more detached, right? Because Capricorns, they do have that lightheartedness to them usually, especially like I mentioned, they have usually good sense of humor. It's kind of usually expected because they're so buttoned down and rigid, or they can show up that way, especially when they're younger, right? Capricorn is the sign that gets young, that gets older. So as like in childhood and the teenage years and all of that, Capricorn can be a little bit more rigid, a little bit structured, a little bit more confined and contained. And as they get older, they loosen up a little bit. But one of the downfalls of Capricorn is that when they get scared or when they get sort of defensive, or when they feel uncertain of what's going on around them, like things are unstable, or their structures are being challenged or something like that, they will adhere to the rules a little bit. They will conform for the sake of company. They will follow the rules regardless of whether or not those rules are moral or ethical. And so that's where it's sort of a danger in Capricorn, because they do tend to gravitate toward power and authority regardless of where that authority is coming from. Authority is a high integrity authority, or whether that is just the rules, right? They're the ones that'll follow the rules because of the rules, even if these are certain rules that maybe are meant to be broken. Maybe these are rules that are not necessarily moral or just. And so there's a danger there, right? Of becoming too authoritative, too authoritarian, and too stuck to following the rules, right? And you can become too rigid and attached to the way you think things that should be, too conformist, too materialistic, overly cautious. It's another thing too, Capricorn, when it feels uncertain, when it feels defensive, all of those different things, it can be very, very cautious, and it can have a difficult time being more lighthearted, more adaptable. And so they need to learn to integrate the opposite, which is Cancer, right? Because Capricorn can be a little cold, a little too pragmatic, too earthy, a little too practical. And so they need to integrate that opposite energy of Cancer. And Capricorns, as they get older, I've noticed they can become very, very nurturing. Still hold that Capricorn nature, but they become very, very nurturing, more evolved. They can become very good at like nurturing groups of people, right? So they can be in positions of authority, but they can do so in a very practical, very linear linear, very logical, also is very nurturing and supportive to the people that they're, you know, overseeing. And they can be really good teachers for the exact same reason. And so, you know, they're very, very good sides of this. They're very, very ambitious, very hardworking, and very determined people. They, you know, they know how to accomplish their goals, and they know how to lead others to do the same. All right, Aquarius. Aquarius is an interesting, enigmatic sort of sign. They tend to be very cold and detached. You know, actually, before you get to know, they can be very aloof. Want to be seen as like cool, calm, collected, and they're very voyeuristic in their approach to engaging with other people. Even though they can be very friendly, right? That's one of the signs that to do with friends and friendships, connecting with groups, and sort of the hive mind and all of that. They have a voyeuristic and detached way of interrelating with people, where they keep people sort of at distance, right? And so they'll come across being very cold and very aloof, and they want to figure everyone else out, but they don't want themselves to be figured out by other people. And that's where that detachment, that sort of voyeuristic quality comes in. So they want to see what everyone else is doing, and, you know, they want to be part of the crowd, but they don't necessarily want to in that heartfelt sort of way. So they have to learn to integrate that, right? They have to learn to open and be more vulnerable, and to allow other people in. Because, you know, Leo usually gets wounded because they're so open and so vulnerable, right? Capricorn is sort of, or Aquarius is sort of the opposite. They're very cold, very aloof, very detached, and they do that for a reason, defense mechanism, right? They don't want to get hurt. They were hurt at a young age, or that an experience that showed them that it's not good to share your emotions or to connect with people in this way. And so, you know, they can keep people, since they can push other people away when they're out of alignment. Another thing too is that even though they can be very individualistic, right? They want to be the unique little butterflies. They can be very, very, very dramatic, especially when it comes to adherence to sort of the prevailing thought, the hive mind. And so they can be very progressive. They're very dogmatic in their sort of in their belief systems, especially their political and religious and whatever ideologies that they have. They've decided something, even if it's something that's very strange, and very off the wall and off the cuff, like you don't quite understand what they're getting at. They are committed to that thing that they've decided is true. And it's very hard to sway an Aquarian in another direction, right? And so they have a very odd way of coming to decisions and coming to their thought processes, and of acquiring their beliefs. And I have a lot of Aquarius friends, and I love them to death, but somebody explained to me certain their thinking, or that they feel, they believe to be true. And I'm just like, where did it, like, to understand how they came to this, right? It's not necessarily logical and rational to me, but to them. And that's okay. They have their own way of thinking and perceiving the world. And it is very unique, can be perceived as eccentric, and not everyone's going to understand them fully. And they like it that way, right? They don't be understood. And so that's part of it too. But, you know, they're not always vested in true autonomy, right? They're vested in the surface level autonomy, which is like, you know, being flashy and like wearing crazy clothes and like being, you know, like you're unique and rebellious, but you know, so much so that people approve of this, right? It's not necessarily being fully authentic. So the evolved sort of nature of Aquarius is into opposition. It's integrating the energy of Libra, which is being more authentic and being more true to yourself and what your heart and what your soul needs and what your soul wants. So being unique and in the way that is truthful to yourself, not caring so much about what others will think about what you're doing, because that's an Aquarius sort of trap as well, caring too much about what other people think, which again causes that aloofness, that judgment, because you don't want people to judge you and to see your vulnerabilities and to see what's going on beneath the surface. So sharing yourself with the world can be, you know, sharing your heart, you know, with other people can be very healing and rebalancing to Aquarius, finding true autonomy, right, where you're connecting with who you truly, what your soul wants, instead of just connecting to, you know, this outward expression of rebellion just for rebellion's sake. They're very, very innovative. They're formist of our society. They're they can be altruistic. They can be very also unpossessive. So they let other people do their thing, even if they themselves adhere to a certain mindset. They don't necessarily always been on other people. Even it can be a little dogmatic mindset. you know, they can, if they adapt, you know, and if they are in balance, they can also very unpossessed and be very supportive of other people and their unique minds, and allowing them to march the beat of their own drummer, right? So very supportive of alternative ways of thinking, of people who think out box, who are, you know, different, this sort of outlier society, the fringe. And you know, so that's one of the sort of good qualities of Aquarius, that balances out of the imbalanced part of Aquarius, right? Okay. And so finally we have Pisces. Pisces is one of the most difficult sun and rising signs. So I'm going to move this a little bit because I have Virgo, I have my notes. But Pisces is one of the most difficult sun and rising signs, because it deals with a lot of ambiguity and a lot of projection, a lot of scapegoating. You know, people tend, because Pisces encompasses energy of all 12 signs, people tend to project their feelings, their emotions, their energy onto Pisces. And so, you know, they can project either this really beautiful guru energy where they're like, oh my God, this person is so great, they're so wonderful, onto the Pisces person, even if it's unwarranted. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, they can escape them and project negative energy to them and blame them for things they didn't actually do. And so they have to deal with this sort of weird energy where it's difficult for them to know they are, because people don't respond to them appropriately, the way that they're acting out in the world, if that makes sense. So they'll think that they're showing up in one way, and then people are responding to them in a completely different way, and so they get weird feedback from their environment. So it's very difficult for them to develop their identity and to really fully come into their identity. Pisces people, a lot of times, are not self-aware. They'll think that they're very self-aware, but they won't. Everyone else will see that they're not, right? Everybody else will see what's really going on, except for the Pisces person. They have a hard time seeing themselves truly. They can come to that place, and a lot of times they do, but especially early on, they're not very self-aware. It's like the opposite of right. Virgo is very self-conscious and overly self-aware, to the point where they are just very all the time. Pisces is the exact opposite of that. They don't have that level of self-awareness. They can't critique themselves really, and a lot of that's because they get the right feedback from their environment. So it confuses them and it distorts who they are, it distorts their identity. And so that's kind of one of the downfalls. You have to integrate that Virgos that become more self-critical, a little bit more judgmental of themselves, learn to, you know, evaluate themselves, evaluate their identity, to know themselves a little bit more deeply. You know, they'll the other thing too is that it is a water sign, right? So Pisces, like all the water signs, can take things a little too personally. They can get stuck in martyrdom or a victim mentality. They tend to elevate or sort of how do you describe that? Where you have place this like projecting that guru energy, right? They tend to elevate the martyr. They tend to elevate the victim because they're so compassionate. They're so like loving, so caring that to them, victimhood is like they want to support those people, right? They want to support the victim. They want to support the underdog. They feel that compassion for them, but they can identify with that a little bit too much, and they can play the victim. They tend to get hurt very easily. You know, they're another sign that can be very fragile. They can, you know, take some very harshly. They don't necessarily they're not they just take things a little too seriously when it comes to or take things a little too personally, right? They can get very easily. They're very vulnerable, very open. They're very empathetic. They're very compassionate, and they don't really feel the emotions of other people around the point where they know where they begin and the other person ends, and their pain hurts, you know, the other person's pain hurts the Pisces person. And so it's very difficult to have good boundaries being a Pisces, you know, where you end and the other person begins, and that makes things even more confusing, right? So it's constantly searching and trying to figure out who you are, what you are, boundaries are. Pisces has a difficult dealing with reality because it's so non-physical, so non-linear, and so they tend to, you know, be very prone to escapism through drugs, alcohol, right? Those two things, addictions, can be very prominent with a lot of Pisces energy. Or it could be things like fantasy, delusion, right? They can wear these rose-colored glasses as a defense mechanism because they feel so deeply, and it hurts them so much to see things that are bad, that are traumatic, that are difficult, that are negative, right? They tend to be the type of people, not every Pisces does this, by the way. I'm just saying, like, it's the extremes, right? These are the extremes natures of each sign. With Pisces, they can live in this bubble. They're the type of people that wants to put up this like big bubble where there's nothing's negative. It's all positive. It's all love and light and rainbows and lollipops. And that's a way of spiritual bypassing, right? It's like bypassing what reality and like putting yourself in this state that's not realistic and it's not sustainable, where you're not really addressing the issues that are at hand and what's really going on here. You're disconnecting yourself from reality and living in this like love and light bubble. And that can happen with a lot of Neptune energy too. Like Neptune conjunctions to the sun, regardless of what the sun sign is in, it's even stronger. Like this energy of rose-colored glasses, spiritual bypassing, not wanting to, see things in this negative light, only wanting to see the good in people, which is wonderful and that can be beautiful, right? You have this really incredible talent for seeing the best in everyone. And, we all need that sometimes, right? We all need to have someone who can see us in that light, and we all want to be seen in that light. But it can lead you to, your own undoing, your own downfall, because you're letting these people in, you're ignoring, what they're truly doing. You're ignoring their true nature. You're ignoring their negativity. And then you end up getting hurt, right? And so they tend to have the rose-colored glasses. They tend to have a bubble around them sometimes, where they don't want to see things for what they truly are. They don't want to see themselves truly and fully too, because then they have to deal with it. And again, this is not all Pisces people. This is just, the extremes, right? But they can get into these situations like that. The other thing too is, fantasy, getting lost in fantasy, getting lost in fantasizing, thinking about the future, fantasizing about the future, but not actually taking action into doing something. So they fantasize about the way that they want things to be, but they have trouble actually getting there and taking action. And so they have an idea in their head of how things should be and how things will be. But then when it doesn't happen, they get very upset, with themselves, or upset with the world when they haven't actually done anything to get there. And again, this is not all Pisces people. This is just in general, the extreme end of Pisces. And the opposite end though, so because Pisces is such a challenging sun sign and it's such a challenging rising sign to have, it's also one of the most rewarding once you've dealt with these experiences. Pisces is deeply loving, deeply compassionate, very altruistic, very creative and artistic in a way that's deeply, deeply expressive, right? They can express their souls through their artistic creations. They're really good at also really great actors and actresses and things like that too, because they can sort of become these other people, right? They're the changelings too. They can kind of like Gemini, but not in the same way. They can adapt to their situations and the environments as needed, so they can be whoever they need to be in any situation. They can put themselves in other people's shoes very, very easily, because they encompass the energy of all the archetypes of all the signs. And so they really, really have a deep connection to other people. They're deeply, deeply compassionate, deeply loving, deeply emotional, deeply intuitive, to the point where a lot of them can have psychic abilities or visions. They can get these downloads, these impressions. They navigate the world through a way that's non-physical and non-linear. And, that teaches all of us to be a little less engrossed in the physicality and in the linear, the logical, and all of that. And so they're a very transcendent sign, right? And they're a very compassionate sign, a very loving sign. And when they learn to integrate a little bit more of that practical reality, they can show up and serve other people. They can help other people very deeply, because they are so compassionate and they really do just want to help people. But they need to learn to be more realistic when they're helping. You're not going to help people just by putting them in a bubble, right? You need to be able to see things for what they truly are. And once they get there, very deeply spiritually minded people, very wise, because they understand things beyond this realm. And so I really do love Pisces, one of my favorite signs as well. But they have a difficult time. The sun is very physical. Pisces and Neptune, the most non-physical, non-linear, other dimensional sort of energy. And it's very hard to integrate it. And it's very hard to understand it. And so they feel misunderstood a lot of their lives. And sometimes that's because they don't even fully understand themselves, right? So it's hard for other people to understand you if you don't understand yourself. So there is a need to cultivate self-awareness. But again, deeply loving, deeply, deeply compassionate, deeply creative sign. And so that's Pisces. People sometimes complain that Pisces doesn't get a lot of attention when we do these videos because they're last and all of that. I think I really went pretty in depth into Pisces this time though, because it's a challenging sign to have. You guys who have those Pisces signs, like you're in it, right? You're working through it, and once you do that, the rewards are like exponential. So hang in there if you're having a difficult Pisces time, right? Because you're going to figure it out. And so, yeah, so that's all 12 of the signs. And so I hope you found this information useful. I know that, you know, a lot of you are students of astrology, and it's important to know sort of the whole spectrum of all of the signs, and just in dealing with people in general, right? Understanding this for me really helped me to open up and understand some people in my life that were completely, I just didn't understand. I was judging them, right? Being a Virgo, I didn't understand their perspective, which is another thing that Virgos need to learn to do, to understand the perspective of the other, put yourself in other people's shoes, be more compassionate, integrate that beautiful Pisces energy that we just talked about, right? And Pisces needs to do the opposite. And so learning how other people operate and why they're doing the things that they're doing, even if it doesn't make sense to you, you know, at the time, you start to learn these things about these different signs, and you start to understand people, and it opens you up to be much more compassionate, much more empathetic, much more able to accept other people and their flaws, and, you know, those types of things. And you can work with people better because you understand them better. You know, you can put yourself in their shoes. And so anyway, I hope that this was helpful to you all. If you have any questions about anything that I just covered, please feel free to comment in the comment section below. Also, you can always book a reading with me. I love connecting with you all. I love doing readings. And you can find the information to book a reading from my reader page at the description in below this video as well. And I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I will see you next week. Bye.